To test APIs, we use a Chrome extension called Postman. If you haven't installed it, I highly recommend you to do so because it's a very powerful tool that you should have in your toolbox. So simply search for Postman Chrome extension. Okay, it's the first link here, Postman in Chrome Web Store. Add this to your Chrome and then you have to restart Chrome. Then when you open a new tab, you can go to this apps here and you can find Postman. So this is our Postman. I'm going to make an HTTP post request to this endpoint, localhost port 5000/API/vehicles. Now in the body of the request, I'm going to send raw data as JSON. So here we need to add a JSON object that can be serialized to our vehicle class. So here's our vehicle class. We have these properties, ID, model ID, and so on. So we can simply add model ID here, set it to 1, is registered to true, contact name, let's set it to name, contact email, contact phone, last update, I'm going to set this to year 2000, 1st of January, and you will see why later. And finally, features property, which is going to be an array. In this array, we're going to have vehicle feature objects. Each object has a vehicle ID, which we don't know because we're going to create a new vehicle. So let's just remove that. We're going to add feature ID here. And this object will be mapped to the vehicle feature class. Now copy this, feature 2 and feature 3. Now let's see what happens when we call this endpoint with this data. Send. If you scroll down, look, we got status 200, which represents a successful response. And in the body of the response, we have this object. However, none of the properties that I put in the request are returned in the response. So earlier I set the model ID to 1 or is registered to true, but you can see all these properties are coming with their default value. What's going on here? Because when we deal with complex objects, we need to tell ASP.NET where to find the data to initialize this complex object. And for that, we're going to use an attribute from body. That means the data for this vehicle object is in the body of the request. So save. All right, back here, let's send another request. Okay, and here's the response. You can see model ID is set properly. Model is null, which is a little bit weird. This property should either not be here, or if it's returned in the response, you want to make sure that this has a real model object, not null. Then we have is registered, set to true. Beautiful. Contact name, email, and phone are fine. Last update is serialized properly. And here are our features. Again, this is another weird issue. We have this feature ID 1 here, but the feature property is null. Now, as a hack, we could go and get all these objects from the database and return them in the response. But here we have a bigger issue. Let's look at the body of our request one more time. Look at this features property. It's an array of vehicle feature objects. This syntax here is a little bit too complex for an API because we should aim to make the contract of an API as simple as possible so clients can call it easily, whether that client is an Angular app or a third-party service. So ideally, instead of passing these 3 objects here when creating a vehicle, I would like to add their feature IDs here. So an array of 3 numbers, like this. This will be much cleaner, much simpler. The other issue we have here is this last update property. This is a property that we should set on the server side. We don't want a malicious user to pass this property in the request because they can mess up with our application. They can set this date to, 200 years ago, and that can mess up with the logic of our application somewhere. Also, in some more complex applications, maybe some properties can only be set by certain users, maybe users in a given role. So the issue we have here is that our API endpoint is open to over-posting attacks. So a hacker can send more data than they should be allowed to. For that reason, the input and also the output of our APIs should always be API resources. So here we're not going to expose all the properties in our domain model, this object we pass to this vehicle's endpoint should only have the properties for creating a new vehicle, nothing more. And finally, here's another issue with this object. We have these three properties: contact name, contact email, contact phone. Now, earlier I told you that we added these properties in our vehicle class because currently we don't have complex object support in Entity Framework Core. But when designing APIs, we want to make sure the contract is simple and elegant. So here, ideally, I would like to have a property like contact with three subproperties: name, phone, and email, instead of these three properties here. So you can see how this object, the input to our API endpoint, has evolved independent of our domain model. So next, we're going to create a separate API resource as the input to our new action.